Welcome back to Sleepyside Stories, where the world grows soft and strange, and sleep arrives on the wings of quiet wonder. Tonight, we're gathering something different, something a little more delicate than our usual wanderings through forgotten folklore and dreamlike tales. Tonight is Halloween, and the stories we'll share are not inventions, not myths spun from imagination alone, but allegedly true accounts, documented mysteries and unexplained encounters said to have occurred on or near this particular night of the year, when the boundary between the known and unknown seems, perhaps, just a little thinner than usual. There is something about this time, this specific turning of the calendar, that has always drawn human curiosity toward the edges of what we understand. Ancient cultures marked it as a threshold, a moment when the familiar world grew porous, when whispers might travel more easily between here and elsewhere. And while we no longer speak in terms of spirits crossing over, or gates swinging wide, we still find ourselves drawn to the inexplicable on these October nights, still reaching for answers to questions that hover just beyond the light of our campfires and the glow of our screens. The accounts you'll hear tonight come from research stations buried in Antarctic ice, from declassified government files marked with dates that always seem to circle back to this season, from Soviet archives detailing encounters beneath frozen lakes, and from small towns where unexplained sounds have hummed through the darkness for decades. Some of these stories have been investigated, analysed, and left unresolved. Others remain tucked into the margins of official reports, footnotes that no one quite knew what to do with, observations that didn't fit neatly into any existing framework of understanding. We won't try to solve these mysteries tonight. That's not what we're here for. Instead, we'll let them breathe, let them exist as they are, suspended somewhere between scientific record and campfire tale, between documented fact and enduring folklore. We'll approach them with the same gentle curiosity one might bring to watching stars through thin clouds, knowing that some lights flicker at distances too vast to fully comprehend, yet finding comfort in the act of witnessing them nonetheless. This is not a journey into fear or horror, but rather into wonder, into that particular quiet unease that comes from recognizing how much remains beyond our understanding, how vast the world still is despite all our satellites and sensors and sophisticated instruments. These are stories to drift asleep to, mysteries to carry you softly into dreams, true accounts of the strange and unexplained that remind us the universe is far larger and more peculiar than our daily lives might suggest. If you're new to Sleepyside Stories, welcome to this threshold night. And if you find comfort in these mysteries, if you enjoy drifting through the unknown with quiet fascination rather than fear, please consider following or subscribing. We're here every week, exploring the gentle edges of the world's strangeness, and we'd love to have you join us on future journeys into the soft and inexplicable. Tonight we begin with ice and isolation, with a signal that emerged from beneath the frozen shelf of Antarctica on a night in 1983, when researchers claim they heard something that should not have been possible, a transmission from somewhere that should have held only silence. But before we descend into that particular mystery, take a moment to settle yourself, to let the day release its hold on your shoulders, to allow the ordinary world to recede just slightly. Adjust your pillow, find that position where your body remembers how to rest, and know that for the next 2 hours you need only listen, only drift, only follow these strange and gentle accounts wherever they might lead. The veil is thin tonight, they say, though perhaps it's always been thin, and we've simply chosen this night to pay closer attention, to lean toward the darkness with open curiosity rather than turning away. Perhaps Halloween isn't when the world grows stranger, but when we finally give ourselves permission to acknowledge the strangeness that's been there all along, humming beneath the surface of our everyday lives, waiting patiently for us to notice. So let's begin our journey through these allegedly true encounters, these documented mysteries that cluster around this particular season like moths around a distant light. Let's explore the stories that refuse to be easily explained, the accounts that remain filed in archives and tucked into the memories of those who witnessed them, still unexplained, still quietly waiting at the edges of what we know. The night is long, and there are many mysteries to visit before sleep finds you completely. Chapter 1. The McMurdo Signal, 1983. McMurdo Station sits on the edge of Ross Island in Antarctica, a collection of buildings and research facilities perched at the boundary between land and ice, between human habitation and the vast white emptiness that stretches in all directions. It's one of the most isolated outposts on Earth, a place where scientists spend months studying ice cores and atmospheric conditions, where the sun disappears entirely for weeks at a time, and where the silence, when the generators quiet and the wind calms, becomes something almost tangible, a presence in itself. In October of 1983, as Halloween approached and the Antarctic spring began its slow awakening, a small team of researchers manning the station's communications array reported something unusual. The exact details remain somewhat unclear, filtered through decades and the natural tendency of institutions to downplay anomalies that don't fit established patterns, but the core account persists in various forms across amateur radio communities and among those who study unexplained signal phenomena. They claim to have received a transmission that appeared to originate not from the surface, not from another research station or passing aircraft, but from somewhere beneath the Ross Ice Shelf itself. The signal was described as rhythmic, almost mechanical in its precision, a series of low-frequency pulses that repeated in patterns lasting approximately 47 seconds before beginning again. It wasn't random noise or interference from their equipment, the researchers insisted, but something structured, something that suggested intentionality. One of the technicians, whose name has been omitted from most versions of this account, reportedly spent 3 nights documenting the transmission, noting its consistency, its unwavering pattern, the way it seemed to strengthen slightly during certain hours and fade during others, as if responding to something they couldn't measure or detect. What made the signal particularly unusual wasn't merely its existence, but its apparent source location. The Ross Ice Shelf is a floating platform of ice roughly the size of France, hundreds of meters thick in places, pressing down upon dark water that rarely sees light. Beneath it lies an environment that remains largely unexplored, a cold and pressurized world where conventional wisdom suggests little could survive, let alone generate organized radio signals. Yet the triangulation data, such as it was with the limited equipment available at McMurdo in the early 80s, consistently pointed toward a location approximately 15 kilometers out onto the shelf at a depth the technicians estimated to be somewhere between the ice and the seafloor below. Official records from McMurdo Station for that period make no mention of the signal, which some interpret as evidence of a cover-up, while others suggest more mundane explanations, that perhaps the incident was logged differently, classified under routine technical anomalies, or simply lost in the vast archives that accumulate at research stations over decades. What we do have are accounts from individuals who claim to have been there, or who knew people who were there, stories that circulate through forums dedicated to unexplained phenomena and occasionally surface in collections of Antarctic mysteries. Some researchers have speculated about natural explanations, the ice itself generating sounds through expansion and contraction, or perhaps seismic activity translated into electromagnetic signals through some mechanism not yet fully understood. Others point to the possibility of equipment malfunction, radio waves bouncing in unusual ways through the unique atmospheric conditions of Antarctica, creating the illusion of a signal originating from beneath the ice. These are reasonable explanations, the kind that allow us to file such accounts away as curiosities rather than genuine mysteries. But what gives the McMurdo signal its enduring quality, what keeps it alive in the collections of allegedly true Halloween occurrences, is the timing and what reportedly happened on the night of October 31st itself. According to the accounts, the signal that had been intermittent and somewhat unpredictable over the previous weeks suddenly became constant that evening, maintaining a steady rhythm without variation for approximately 6 hours. And then, just before dawn on November 1st, it simply stopped, falling silent so completely that the technicians initially thought their receiving equipment had failed. And one detail that appears in multiple versions of the story involves a journal entry, allegedly written by one of the researchers and later shared with colleagues at a conference years afterward. The entry described standing outside the station on that Halloween night, listening to the wind move across the ice, and experiencing an overwhelming sense that something beneath the shelf was listening back, that the signal wasn't simply random noise or natural phenomenon, but something aware, something responding to the presence of human consciousness at the edge of its frozen world. The transmission was never heard again, at least not officially. McMurdo Station continued its research. Winter came and went, and the incident faded into the background of more pressing scientific work. Some who claim familiarity with the story suggest that listening protocols were quietly changed afterward, that certain frequencies were monitored more carefully, or perhaps avoided entirely. But these are the kind of details that blur with time and telling, impossible to verify, easy to dismiss. What remains is the image itself. Researchers in a small warm room surrounded by thousands of miles of ice, hearing something that seemed to pulse up from beneath the frozen shelf, a pattern that suggested meaning even if that meaning could never be deciphered. Antarctica has always been a place where the strange feels possible, where the isolation and extremity of the environment seem to thin the barriers between the known and the mysterious, where scientists working at the edge of human habitation occasionally glimpse something that doesn't quite fit the models and equations that usually explain the world so well. Whether the McMurdo signal was real in the way its witnesses claimed, or whether it was a misinterpretation of natural phenomena filtered through the psychological pressure of isolation and darkness, we may never know with certainty. But on quiet nights, when the wind moves across the Ross Ice Shelf and the stars wheel overhead in the endless Antarctic darkness, one can imagine those pulses still travelling through ice and water, a rhythm beneath the world, waiting patiently in the cold and the silence for someone to listen again. Chapter 2: The Lake Baikal Encounter, 1982. Lake Baikal rests in southern Siberia like an ancient scar across the landscape, a crescent of water so deep and so old that it holds secrets. Geology is still working to understand. It's the deepest lake on Earth, descending more than a mile at its furthest point, and it contains nearly a quarter of the planet's fresh surface water, a massive reservoir that has existed for roughly 25 million years, long enough to develop its own unique ecosystem, creatures found nowhere else, life adapted to darkness and pressure and cold. In the autumn of 1982, as October gave way to the first hard freezes that would eventually seal the lake beneath meters of ice, a team of Soviet Navy divers was conducting training exercises in the waters near Cape Tolstoy, a remote stretch of coastline where the lake drops away quickly into depth that swallow light completely. The divers were practicing cold water techniques, testing equipment, preparing for the kind of operations that might be necessary in the Arctic waters to the north. What they reported encountering during those exercises has remained one of the more persistent mysteries associated with the lake, a story that surfaces periodically in collections of unexplained phenomena and is said to be quietly discussed among certain Russian research communities each Halloween, as if the date itself has become connected to the memory of what was seen or claimed to be seen beneath that cold surface. The account, pieced together from various sources over the years, describes a dive that took place on October 28th, just 3 days before Halloween. 7 divers descended to a depth of approximately 50 meters, where the water takes on a particular quality of darkness, a blue-grey dimness where even powerful light seemed to penetrate only a short distance before being absorbed by the endless volume of water. It was there, according to the reports, that they encountered figures. The descriptions vary depending on which version of the story one finds, filtered as they are through translation and time and the natural evolution that occurs when unusual accounts are retold. But certain details remain consistent across most versions. The figures were described as humanoid in general shape, roughly 3 meters tall, moving through the water with a fluidity that suggested they belonged there, that this was their environment rather than a place they were visiting with the aid of technology. They wore no breathing apparatus that the divers could identify, no suits or equipment of any recognizable kind, though some accounts mention a silvery quality to their appearance, as if they were covered in something reflective or perhaps naturally luminescent in ways that human eyes could barely register. What made the encounter particularly unsettling, according to those who claim knowledge of the incident, was not the appearance of the figures themselves, but their apparent awareness of the divers. They didn't flee or approach, but rather maintained a steady distance, moving in parallel with the diving team for several minutes before descending deeper, dropping into darkness with a speed that seemed impossible, given the pressure and the cold. One diver reportedly tried to follow, dropping another 10 meters before his team members pulled him back, recognizing the danger of pursuing something into depths their equipment and training hadn't prepared them for. The official response to the incident, such as records exist, was predictably measured. The divers were debriefed, their accounts documented, and the encounter was classified under various headings that suggested equipment malfunction, nitrogen narcosis, or misidentification of natural phenomena. Lake Baikal is home to the nerpa, a species of freshwater seal, and to fish that grow larger in these depths than their cousins in shallower waters. Under conditions of low visibility and the psychological stress of deep, cold water diving, the human mind is capable of transforming the ordinary into the extraordinary, of seeing intention and structure where none exists. But the story didn't end with that single encounter. Over the following weeks, as ice began to form across the surface of the lake, other divers from the same unit reported similar sightings, always at depth, always in that particular stretch of water near Cape Tolstoy. The figures were seen again on November 2nd, though this time at a greater distance, barely visible at the edge of the diver's light range, and then once more on November the 7th, when a different team conducting follow-up exercises reported shapes moving beneath them, deeper than their lights could reach, large forms that seemed to be observing from below. After that, according to the accounts, the training exercises were quietly moved to a different part of the lake, and the area near Cape Tolstoy was designated as unsuitable for deep diving operations due to unspecified geological concerns. Whether this was a genuine safety measure or a way of avoiding further encounters is left to speculation, one of many details that blur when trying to separate documented fact from the stories that grow around unusual events. Lake Baikal has always attracted unusual reports, sightings of things that don't quite match known species, lights seen moving beneath the ice during winter months, stories passed down through generations of fishermen and local communities about the lake having depths that go deeper than any measurement suggests, places where the water touches something else, some other realm or dimension. Scientists who study the lake tend to dismiss such accounts as folklore, the natural result of human imagination encountering an environment that remains largely unexplored despite decades of research. Yet the lake's sheer depth and age give weight to the possibility that life here might have evolved in ways we haven't yet documented, that creatures adapted to the pressure and darkness of the deepest waters might exist in forms that bear little resemblance to anything we've catalogued. Baikal is old enough and isolated enough that unique evolutionary paths seem not just possible but likely. Whether those paths could produce something resembling the figures the divers reported is a question that science cannot yet answer definitively, suspended somewhere between outright dismissal and cautious acknowledgement that the lake still holds secrets we haven't reached. The Soviet Navy divers who reported the encounters have largely remained silent over the years, bound by military protocols or perhaps simply by the knowledge that such accounts are rarely received with the seriousness they might deserve. But the story persists, especially among those who collect accounts of unexplained phenomena occurring around Halloween, as if the date has become a marker, a reminder that something was glimpsed in those cold depths during the autumn of 1982, something that moved with purpose through water that should have been empty. On still nights when the ice is thin and new across Lake Baikal's surface, when the moon reflects off that frozen mirror and the world above and below seem to merge for just a moment, one might imagine those figures still moving through the depths, following their own rhythms and purposes in the darkness, occasionally rising high enough to notice when visitors descend from the surface world, watching with whatever senses they possess, then returning to depths where human light and human curiosity cannot follow. Chapter 3. The Black Vault Halloween Files. There exists in the digital archives of the Internet a repository known as the Black Vault, a collection of hundreds of thousands of declassified government documents obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests, filed and organised by researchers who believe that transparency matters, that the public has a right to examine what their governments have observed and chosen, for various reasons, to keep quiet about for years or decades. Among these documents, buried in reports spanning from the 1950s through the turn of the millennium, a curious pattern emerges when one searches for dates, a clustering of unexplained incidents that seem to gather around the final night of October with a frequency that exceeds what simple coincidence might suggest. The files themselves are often fragmentary, pages redacted in places where information remains classified, accounts written in the careful, bureaucratic language of military observers and radar technicians who witnessed something unusual and dutifully recorded it, then watched as their reports disappeared into filing systems where such things go to be forgotten. But when examined together, when the dates are aligned and the locations mapped, a picture begins to form of Halloween nights marked by phenomena that defied conventional explanation, events that registered on instruments designed to detect aircraft and missiles but which behaved in ways that suggested neither. One of the earliest documented accounts comes from October 31st, 1957, when radar operators at North American Aerospace Defense Command Facility, NORAD, in Colorado detected multiple objects moving at speeds that exceeded anything in the known capabilities of aircraft at that time. The report, declassified decades later with several sections blacked out, describes targets appearing suddenly on screens, moving in patterns that suggested intelligent control, then vanishing without any corresponding visual sighting or communication. The objects were tracked for approximately 40 minutes before they simply ceased to appear, as if they had never been there at all, leaving only the recorded data and the testimony of multiple trained operators who watched the same impossible movements on their displays. What made this particular incident noteworthy, beyond the objects themselves, was what accompanied them. Several observers stationed outside the facility reported seeing unusual auroral activity in the sky that night, lights that moved in ways the northern lights typically don't, forming shapes and patterns that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the radar contacts. The official explanation, documented in the file, attributed the radar anomalies to atmospheric conditions and the lights to unusually strong geomagnetic activity. But the report also noted, in a brief footnote that survived redaction, that similar phenomena had been observed on the same date in 1954 and would be observed again in subsequent years, a detail that suggests someone was paying attention to the pattern even if they weren't prepared to acknowledge it publicly. Moving forward through the decades, the files reveal other Halloween nights marked by similar strangeness. October 31st, 1968, multiple radar installations along the eastern seaboard reported coordinated tracking of objects moving in formation over the Atlantic Ocean, maintaining speeds and altitudes that varied in ways no known aircraft could manage. The objects appeared at sunset and remained visible on radar until shortly after midnight, then dispersed in different directions, some heading out over the ocean, others moving inland before fading from detection. Fighter aircraft were scrambled from two separate bases to investigate, according to the declassified records, but neither flight made visual contact with anything unusual, despite the fact that ground radar continued to show the objects in positions that should have made them visible to the pilots. The disconnect between what instruments detected and what human eyes could confirm became a recurring theme in these reports, as if whatever was being observed existed in a space that machines could register, but direct perception could not access. In 1975, on Halloween night, a weather research station in Alaska documented atmospheric disturbances that corresponded with radar anomalies detected by military installations in the region. The weather instruments recorded sudden localized changes in air pressure and temperature, fluctuations that formed patterns rather than the random variations one would expect from natural phenomena. At the same time, defense radar tracked objects moving through the upper atmosphere at altitudes where the air is too thin for conventional flight, speeds that would have generated heat signatures that should have been visible to infrared detection systems but somehow weren't. The report from that night includes testimony from civilian witnesses in several small communities who described seeing lights in the sky that seemed to dance between the stars, appearing and disappearing in sequences that felt, to those watching, almost like communication, like something trying to establish a pattern that human observers might recognize. One witness, a schoolteacher whose statement was included in the file, described the experience as feeling watched, not threateningly but with a kind of curious attention, as if whatever produced the lights was as interested in the people below as they were in the phenomenon above. Through the 80s and 90s, the Halloween files continue to accumulate. 1983, the same year as the McMurdo signal, saw multiple radar installations across the northern United States tracking objects that moved in synchronized patterns, appearing to respond to each other across distances of hundreds of miles. 1991 brought reports of unusual electromagnetic interference, affecting communication systems at several military bases, disruptions that lasted for exactly the duration of Halloween night and ceased with the arrival of November 1st. 1997 saw auroral activity documented at latitudes far south of where such phenomena typically occur, lights described by observers as moving with intention rather than the random shimmer of natural aurora. What ties these reports together, beyond their timing, is a quality of organized strangeness, a sense that whatever was being observed operated according to rules or patterns that human technology could detect but not decode. The objects appeared on radar but not to visual observation, or appeared to the eye but not to instruments. They moved in ways that suggested coordination across vast distances, as if responding to signals or following paths that existed outside normal space. They manifested during specific hours, often between sunset and midnight on October 31st, then faded with the arrival of the new day. Skeptics point to the human tendency to find patterns where none exist, to the fact that military installations are constantly detecting anomalies that turn out to be weather balloons, atmospheric reflections, equipment malfunctions, or misidentified conventional aircraft. They note that Halloween, being a date of cultural significance, might naturally draw more attention to unusual events that occur on that night, creating a selection bias, where phenomena observed on October 31st are remembered and reported, while similar events on other dates are forgotten or dismissed. These are reasonable objections, the kind that keep such files relegated to the margins of serious discussion, curiosities rather than evidence of anything genuinely unexplained. And yet the files exist. Hundreds of pages of official reports documenting trained observers witnessing things that shouldn't have been there, instruments recording data that didn't match any known phenomena, patterns that emerged across decades when viewed together, but which each individual incident, taken alone, could be explained away as isolated anomaly. The Black Vault continues to grow as more documents are declassified and released, and each year around Halloween, researchers comb through new editions, looking for that particular date, seeing if the pattern continues into years more recent. Sometimes they find nothing, years where October 31st passed without unusual incident, or at least without incident that was documented and preserved. But often enough to maintain interest, they find new reports, new accounts of radar operators watching their screens on Halloween night and seeing something that made them reach for their logbooks and carefully document what they were witnessing, knowing it would probably be filed away and forgotten, but recording it nonetheless because that's what observers do when they see something that doesn't fit. On Halloween nights, when the sky's clear and the stars are visible, when radar dishes turn their silent attention upward, and instruments wait patiently for signals that may or may not arrive, one might wonder if something out there is paying attention too, if whatever created those patterns across decades is still present, still moving through spaces we can only glimpse through our machines, still choosing this particular night to make itself known in ways that leave just enough evidence to wonder about, but never quite enough to prove. Chapter 4, The Tau Signal, 1998. There are sounds that exist at the edge of human perception, frequencies so low or so faint that not everyone can hear them, vibrations that some people register as clear and undeniable, while others, standing in the same location, experience only silence. In the small town of Taos, New Mexico, nestled in the high desert where the Sangre de Cristo Mountains rise against vast blue skies, a particular sound has been reported by residents for decades, a low-frequency hum that seems to emanate from nowhere and everywhere at once, a vibration that those who hear it describe as maddening in its persistence and impossible to escape. The phenomenon became widely known in the early 1990s when enough residents had reported the sound that scientific investigation seemed warranted. Researchers arrived with equipment designed to detect low-frequency acoustics, electromagnetic fields, seismic activity, anything that might explain what a significant portion of the population claimed to be hearing. They conducted surveys, interviewed witnesses, measured ambient sound levels at various locations throughout the town and surrounding areas. What they found was both validating and deeply puzzling, confirmation that people were genuinely experiencing something, combined with a complete inability to identify what that something might be or where it was coming from. The hum was described consistently across multiple witnesses as a low droning sound, comparable to the noise of a distant diesel engine idling, or the vibration of heavy machinery operating far underground. It was not constant for everyone. Some reported hearing it only at night. Others claimed it was present always, but more noticeable in quiet moments. Many said it was worse indoors than outside, as if walls and structures somehow amplified whatever frequency was involved. And almost universally, those who heard the hum reported that it interfered with sleep, created feelings of unease and anxiety, and seemed impossible to block out with earplugs or white noise or any of the usual methods people employ to escape unwanted sound. What made the Taos hum particularly mysterious was its selectivity. In households where one person heard the sound clearly and constantly, another person might experience total silence, might sleep peacefully while their partner lay awake, tormented by a vibration that refused to stop. This selectivity suggested the phenomenon might be internal rather than external, perhaps something about individual hearing sensitivity or neurological processing rather than an actual sound wave moving through the air. But those who experienced the hum rejected this explanation, insisted that what they were hearing was real and external, that something in or around Taos was generating a signal their ears happened to be tuned to receive while others remained oblivious. The investigations yielded no definitive answers. Acoustic sensors detected no unusual low-frequency sounds in the range that witnesses described. Electromagnetic field measurements showed nothing out of the ordinary. Seismic monitoring revealed the normal low-level vibrations one would expect in a geologically active region, but nothing that correlated with when witnesses reported hearing the hum most intensely. Industrial sources were investigated and ruled out. There was no factory or generator or underground facility that could account for the widespread nature of the reports. By the late 90s, the Taos hum had become something of a accepted mystery, documented but unexplained, a phenomenon that scientists acknowledged without being able to solve. Similar hums had been reported in other locations around the world, suggesting this wasn't unique to Taos, but part of some larger pattern of low-frequency perception that science hadn't yet fully mapped. The town itself seemed to accept the hum as one of its peculiar characteristics, something that some residents lived with and others never noticed, a feature of the local environment as normal and inexplicable as the particular quality of light that artists had been drawn to for generations. But there was another element to the story, one that emerged more quietly through conversations among long-term residents and those who had tracked the phenomenon over years, rather than conducting brief investigative visits. Some claimed that the hum intensified on Halloween night, that October 31st brought a particular quality to the vibration, a deepening or strengthening that made it audible even to people who normally didn't perceive it, or made it unbearable to those who lived with it constantly throughout the year. The Halloween connection was documented most explicitly in 1998, when a researcher who had been studying the hum for several years organised a listening event, gathering witnesses together on the night of October 31st to compare experiences and document any variations in the phenomenon. 23 people participated, some who regularly heard the hum and others who had never perceived it before. They positioned themselves at various locations around Taos, from the plaza at the town's centre to remote areas in the surrounding hills, and maintained contact through radio communication, reporting their observations throughout the night. What emerged from that Halloween listening event was a pattern of reports suggesting something unusual was occurring. Multiple witnesses who had never heard the hum before reported perceiving it for the first time that night, describing it exactly as long-term sufferers did. A low persistent drone that seemed to come from below or beyond, impossible to locate but undeniably present. Those who regularly heard the hum reported that it was stronger than usual, more insistent, and that it seemed to pulse or vary in intensity in ways they hadn't experienced before, as if the source, whatever it was, had increased its output for this particular night. The intensification was reported to begin around sunset and continue until approximately 2 in the morning, at which point several witnesses noted that the hum suddenly decreased, returning to what they considered its normal baseline level, or, for those who typically didn't hear it, fading back into imperceptibility. The timing was consistent across different locations, suggesting that whatever caused the variation wasn't localized to a single area but affected the entire region simultaneously. Subsequent Halloween nights brought similar reports from some of those who had participated in the 98 listening event, a sense that October 31st carried some quality that amplified whatever frequency the hum occupied. But formal investigation of this Halloween connection has been limited, the kind of observation that falls between established scientific protocols and the anecdotal accounts that populate local folklore. Some researchers who studied the Taos hum acknowledged hearing about the Halloween intensification, but found it difficult to design experiments that could definitively test whether the phenomenon was real or the result of heightened attention on a culturally significant night. Theories about the hum's source have ranged across disciplines. Some suggest it might be geological, vibrations travelling through rock formations in ways that create acoustic effects in specific locations. Others point to atmospheric phenomena, low-frequency sound waves generated by wind patterns, interacting with the particular topography around Taos. There are those who wonder if it might be technological, some kind of communications array or monitoring system operating at frequencies most people can't detect. And then there are explanations that venture into more speculative territory, suggestions that the hum might be connected to the region's long history of reported unusual phenomena, that Taos sits at some kind of acoustic or electromagnetic confluence that makes it particularly receptive to signals from sources we haven't yet learned to identify. What remains undeniable is the experience itself, the fact that a significant number of people in and around Taos genuinely perceive a sound that instruments cannot consistently detect, that interferes with their daily lives and has resisted decades of investigation. The Halloween intensification, whether objectively real or the product of collective attention on a night when people are primed to notice the unusual, adds another layer to an already mysterious phenomenon, a suggestion that timing matters, that certain nights might carry qualities that affect how we perceive the world around us, or how the world chooses to make itself known. On quiet October nights in Taos, when the desert air carries the scent of pinon smoke and the stars are so numerous they seem to merge into rivers of light, some residents still hear the hum, still feel that low vibration moving through their homes and bodies, still wonder what it is and where it comes from. And on Halloween night, some of them will pay particular attention, will listen more carefully than usual, wondering if this year the hum will intensify again, will reveal something in its variation that might finally offer a clue to its nature, or whether it will simply continue as it always has, present and persistent and utterly unexplained, a sound at the edge of perception that refuses to be fully heard or entirely dismissed. Chapter 5. The Blue Ridge Disappearance, 1977. The Blue Ridge Mountains stretch along the eastern spine of North America, ancient peaks worn smooth by time and weather, covered in forests so dense that in certain valleys the canopy blocks out the sky entirely, creating a perpetual twilight even at midday. These are old mountains, some of the oldest on Earth, and they carry with them the accumulated mystery of age, stories passed down through generations about lights seen moving between trees, sounds that don't correspond to any known animal, and the occasional hiker who ventures into the woods and simply doesn't come back, leaving behind only questions and the slow work of search teams combing through endless acres of wilderness. On the weekend of October 29th through 31st, 1977, 3 experienced hikers set out on a trail in a remote section of the Blue Ridge, an area known locally but rarely visited by tourists, too far from established campgrounds and scenic overlooks to attract casual visitors. Their names were Michael Brennan, Sarah Chen, and Thomas Ashford, all in their mid-20s, all members of a hiking club based in Charlottesville, Virginia, all equipped with proper gear and enough experience that when they failed to return on schedule, their families initially assumed weather or minor injury had delayed them, rather than imagining anything more serious had occurred. The search began on November 2nd, after the hikers missed their expected return time by more than 24 hours, and attempts to reach them by phone at various ranger stations proved unsuccessful. Search and rescue teams from 3 counties converged on the trail the hikers had indicated they planned to follow, a loop of approximately 15 miles that should have taken them through varying terrain, from dense forest to rocky outcroppings that offered views across valleys filled with autumn colour. The weather that weekend had been cold but clear, no rain or snow that might have created dangerous conditions, no storms that could have swept hikers off exposed ridges or caused flash flooding in the narrow creek beds that wind through those mountains. For 5 days, teams searched. They followed the marked trail and ventured off it, creating search grids that covered hundreds of acres, calling names into the forest and listening for responses that never came. Helicopters flew overhead where the canopy allowed visibility. Thermal imaging equipment was deployed to detect body heat that might indicate someone injured and unable to move. Dogs were brought in to follow scents from clothing provided by the families, animals trained to track through wilderness under the most challenging conditions. On the 6th day, November 7th, a searcher found the first camera. It was lying on a flat rock near a creek, approximately 3 miles from the trailhead, positioned carefully, as if someone had placed it there deliberately rather than dropped it in haste or panic. The camera belonged to Sarah Chen, identified by the floral strap she'd attached to it, a small detail her family had mentioned during interviews with search coordinators. The film inside was intact, still wound and ready for development, protected by the camera's weatherproof casing from the cold nights and morning dew. 2 more cameras were found over the following days, Michael Brennan's approximately half a mile east of Sarah's, and Thomas Ashford's another mile beyond that, both positioned on rocks or stumps in ways that suggested intentional placement rather than accidental loss. No other gear was found, no backpacks or clothing, no signs of struggle or injury, nothing that might indicate what had happened to the hikers themselves. Just the 3 cameras, spaced apart as if marking a path, though a path leading where no one could determine. The film from all 3 cameras was developed immediately, examined with the kind of careful attention reserved for potential evidence, in cases that have moved beyond simple search and rescue into something more troubling. What appeared on those frames was both mundane and deeply strange. Images that seemed at first to show nothing more than fog and forest, but which upon closer inspection revealed qualities that the investigators found difficult to explain or dismiss. The photographs began normally enough, early shots showing the 3 hikers at the trailhead, smiling and ready for their weekend adventure, images of autumn leaves and trail markers, the ordinary documentation of a hiking trip that hundreds of people undertake every weekend across these mountains. But as the sequence progressed, the images began to change in character, becoming less about the hike itself and more focused on light and atmosphere, as if the photographers had become interested in something other than simply recording their journey. There were photographs of fog, dense white mist captured from multiple angles, though according to weather records that weekend had been clear, with no fog reported in the region. The fog in the images appeared to have structure, not the random wisps and eddies one typically sees in natural mist, but formations that suggested layers or boundaries, as if the fog itself was organized in some way the camera could capture, but which made no sense to those viewing the developed prints. Interspersed with the fog images were photographs of light, sources of illumination that appeared to be hovering among trees or moving across clearings, too bright to be flashlights or campfires, too isolated to be anything conventional. The lights appeared on film from all 3 cameras, suggesting that whatever the sources were, they had been visible to all 3 hikers simultaneously, compelling enough that each person had chosen to photograph them independently. What made these light images particularly unusual was their consistency across different cameras and different times, based on the sequence of frames and the positions of shadows in shots where trees or rocks provided reference points. The lights appeared to have been present over an extended period, visible enough and steady enough that the hikers had taken multiple exposures, adjusting angles and distances as if trying to capture something that was eluding clear documentation. The final photographs on each roll of film showed increasingly abstract images, compositions that seemed less like documentary photography and more like attempts to record something that existed partially outside normal visual perception. There were shots where the focus appeared to be on nothing, empty air between trees rendered with careful attention to exposure and framing, as if the photographers were seeing something in that emptiness that the camera could only hint at. And in several frames across all 3 cameras, there appeared to be figures, shapes that might have been shadows or reflections or artifacts of the developing process, but which bore enough resemblance to human forms that investigators spent hours examining them, trying to determine if they represented the hikers themselves, other people who might have been present, or something else entirely. No bodies were ever found. The search was eventually suspended after 2 weeks, with the official status of the 3 hikers listed as missing, presumed dead due to exposure or accident, though privately many of those involved in the search felt that explanation was incomplete, that the careful placement of the cameras and the strange sequence of images suggested something other than simple misadventure in the wilderness. Over the years, various theories have circulated among those interested in unexplained disappearances. Some suggest the hikers encountered something in those mountains that disoriented them, that the fog and lights were real phenomena that led them away from the trail into areas too remote or treacherous for searchers to access. Others wonder if the images represent some kind of psychological break, 3 people simultaneously experiencing a shared delusion that caused them to abandon their equipment and wander into the wilderness. There are those who point to the Halloween timing, suggesting that the date itself might have significance, that whatever the hikers encountered was somehow connected to that thinning of boundaries that cultures have long associated with the final night of October. The Blue Ridge Mountains continue to draw hikers every year, thousands of people who walk those same trails and camp beneath those ancient trees without incident. But among those who know the story of the 1977 disappearance, There's a certain awareness when hiking that particular area, especially around Halloween, a tendency to pay closer attention to fog that forms unexpectedly, to lights that don't quite match the angle or quality of sunset, to moments when the forest feels as if it's waiting for something, watching with an attention that has nothing to do with the wildlife one might expect to encounter. The photographs remain in an evidence archive somewhere, 3 rolls of film that captured something their photographers considered important enough to document carefully, before disappearing into mountains that have held their secret for nearly 5 decades. Whether those images show genuine anomalies, or simply the last confused observations of people who lost their way and succumbed to exposure, is a question that may never be answered with certainty. What remains is the mystery itself. 3 people who walked into autumn mountains on Halloween weekend and left behind only cameras filled with fog and light, visual evidence of something that might have been extraordinary or might have been nothing at all, suspended forever in that uncertain space between explanation and wonder. Chapter 6. The transmission at 2:17 a.m. There's a particular quality to the hours between midnight and dawn, a stillness that belongs neither to the day just ended nor the one about to begin, a pocket of time when the world feels suspended and small sounds carry across great distances. It's during these hours that amateur radio operators do some of their most attentive listening, scanning frequencies that during daylight hours are crowded with commercial broadcasts and routine communications, but which in the deep night sometimes reveal transmissions that seem to come from nowhere, voices and signals that appear briefly on the dial and then vanish, leaving only questions about their origin and purpose. On Halloween night in 2003, several amateur radio operators scattered across the Midwestern United States reported intercepting the same unusual transmission, a broadcast that appeared on their receivers at exactly 2:17 in the morning, lasting for approximately 9 minutes before ceasing as abruptly as it had begun. The operators who logged the transmission were not working together, were not part of any coordinated listening project, but were simply individuals pursuing their hobby in the solitary hours after midnight, each sitting alone with their equipment in basement workshops or spare bedrooms, converted into radio stations, turning dials and adjusting frequencies in the eternal search for something interesting to monitor. The transmission itself was remarkable for its clarity and its strangeness. It appeared on a frequency that is typically reserved for maritime communications, though none of the operators who heard it were near any significant body of water, positioned as they were in states like Iowa, Kansas, and Missouri, hundreds of miles from the nearest ocean. The voice was described consistently across all reports as monotone, almost mechanically flat, neither distinctly male nor female, speaking in English with no discernible accent or regional characteristic, as if deliberately stripped of any quality that might identify the speaker's origin or humanity. What the voice was saying was even more peculiar than how it sounded. It was reading coordinates, long strings of numbers that the operators recognized as following the format used in celestial navigation and astronomy, right ascension and declination values that specify precise locations in the night sky, the way latitude and longitude mark positions on Earth. The voice would recite a complete set of coordinates, pause for exactly 10 seconds, then recite another set continuing this pattern for the entire duration of the transmission. No explanation offered, no context provided, just numbers spoken into the darkness with mechanical precision. One of the operators who intercepted the broadcast, a retired aerospace engineer named Robert Kellerman, had the presence of mind to record the transmission and transcribe the coordinates as they were spoken. In the days following Halloween, he attempted to plot the coordinates, using astronomical software to determine what objects or regions of space the numbers were pointing toward. What he found was both fascinating and frustrating. The coordinates were valid in their format, properly structured according to the conventions of celestial navigation. But when plotted, they pointed to areas of empty space, regions between stars where astronomical surveys had detected nothing of particular interest, no galaxies or nebulae or known phenomena, just the background darkness that fills most of the observable universe. Kellerman shared his findings with other amateur radio enthusiasts through online forums and mailing lists, and soon discovered he wasn't alone in having heard the transmission. 6 other operators came forward with similar experiences, all reporting the same monotone voice, the same maritime frequency, the same precise timing of 2:17 in the morning. 2 of them had also recorded portions of the broadcast, and when their recordings were compared, the coordinates matched exactly, confirming that everyone had indeed been hearing the same transmission, rather than separate coincidental broadcasts. The group of operators who had intercepted the signal began referring to it among themselves as the Halloween transmission, and they set about trying to determine its origin with the dedication that amateur radio culture brings to such mysteries. They analysed the signal characteristics, trying to estimate transmission power and likely distance based on how strongly it had appeared on their receivers. They compared notes on atmospheric conditions that night, wondering if unusual propagation had allowed a local broadcast to be heard across multiple states. They reached out to maritime authorities and Coast Guard stations, asking if any legitimate communications had been scheduled for that frequency at that time, receiving replies that confirmed no authorised broadcasts matched what they had heard. The coordinates themselves became a subject of particular fascination. When plotted together, the 23 sets of coordinates read during the transmission didn't form any recognisable pattern, didn't trace out constellation shapes or geometric forms, didn't correspond to any astronomical catalogue or known survey grid. They appeared to be random points scattered across the celestial sphere, with no common reference frame or organising principle that anyone could detect. Yet the precision with which they were read, down to seconds of arc in some cases, suggested they were meant to indicate something specific, that whoever or whatever had generated the transmission considered these particular empty regions of space significant enough to broadcast to anyone who might be listening. Over the following years, the small community of operators who had intercepted the Halloween transmission maintained a kind of vigil, monitoring the same frequency on subsequent October 31sts, hoping the broadcast might repeat and offer new information or context. Some reported hearing fragments of what might have been similar transmissions in 2004 and 2006, brief bursts of that same monotone voice reading numbers before fading back into static, but nothing with the clarity or duration of the original 2003 broadcast. The phenomenon seemed to have been a singular event, or at least singular in the strength and completeness of its manifestation. Theories about the transmission's origin ranged from the mundane to the exotic. Some suggested it might have been a test of automated broadcasting systems, though why such a test would use astronomical coordinates and occur at 2:17 on Halloween morning remained unexplained. Others wondered if it might have been an elaborate hoax, though the technical requirements to broadcast with enough power to be heard across multiple states would have been substantial, and the motivation for such a hoax unclear given that no one claimed credit or provided any follow-up. There were those who speculated it might have been connected to military or intelligence operations, some kind of coded message using the coordinates as encryption, though attempts to decode the numbers using various cipher methods yielded nothing meaningful. And then there were the more speculative interpretations, suggestions that perhaps the coordinates weren't meaningless at all, that they might point to regions of space that would become significant in the future, or that they indicated locations in dimensions beyond the three spatial ones we can easily perceive, coordinates that made sense in some expanded framework of understanding we haven't yet developed. Some wondered if the transmission might have been meant for recipients other than human listeners, a broadcast directed outward toward whatever might be capable of receiving and interpreting it, with the amateur radio operators merely accidental eavesdroppers on a conversation intended for other participants entirely. What made the Halloween transmission particularly haunting for those who heard it was not the content itself, puzzling as it was, but the quality of absolute purpose in that mechanical voice, the sense that someone or something had carefully prepared these specific coordinates and considered it vitally important to broadcast them at that precise moment on that particular night. There was no hesitation in the delivery, no errors or corrections, just the steady recitation of numbers pointing to empty space, spoken with the kind of certainty that suggested these coordinates meant something to the speaker, even if they meant nothing to anyone listening. Robert Kellerman, the aerospace engineer who first attempted to plot the coordinates, maintained a file on the transmission until his death in 2019, occasionally adding notes when new astronomical discoveries were announced, checking whether any of the coordinate positions had revealed anything unexpected. They never did. The regions of space those numbers indicated remained as empty and unremarkable as when they were first broadcast, offering no hints as to why they might have been considered worth announcing to the darkness. The recording of the transmission still circulates occasionally through amateur radio communities, shared when discussions turn to unexplained broadcasts and mysterious signals, an audio document of something that happened once on a Halloween night and never quite made sense. Listeners who hear it for the first time often report finding it unsettling, not because it sounds threatening or strange, but because it sounds so purposeful, so deliberate in its delivery of information that appears to point nowhere, as if there's meaning present that human understanding simply isn't equipped to recognize. On late October nights, when amateur radio operators sit alone with their equipment and scan through frequencies, looking for distant voices and unusual propagation, some of them still tune to that maritime band around 2:17 in the morning, still listen through the static for any hint of that monotone voice returning with new coordinates, or perhaps explanation for the old ones. The transmission has become part of the folklore of the hobby, a reminder that the airwaves carry more than just conventional communications, that sometimes when conditions align and timing is right, messages arrive from sources we cannot identify, speaking in languages we can transcribe but not comprehend, pointing toward destinations that exist somewhere beyond the edge of current knowledge, or perhaps beyond the edge of anything at all. Conclusion: the quiet between worlds. And so we arrive at the end of our journey through these allegedly true mysteries, these documented encounters and unexplained phenomena that cluster around Halloween like stars gathering at the edge of visible light. We've travelled from Antarctic ice shelves to Siberian lakes, from declassified military files to high desert towns, from mountain disappearances to midnight radio transmissions, following a thread of strangeness that connects across decades and distances, stories that refuse easy explanation and linger in the spaces between what we know and what we wonder about. What ties these accounts together, beyond their timing and their resistance to conventional understanding, is something more fundamental, a quality of human experience that seems as old as consciousness itself. We are a species that listens to the darkness and hears whispers, that looks at empty sky and sees patterns, that stands at boundaries between the known and unknown, and feels drawn toward what lies beyond. Every culture in every era has marked certain times as threshold moments, nights when the ordinary world grows thin and something else presses close, moments when attention must be paid because the universe might be speaking in languages we're only beginning to learn to hear. Halloween, in its modern form, carries forward this ancient impulse, this need to acknowledge that mystery still exists despite all our instruments and explanations, that wonder persists at the edges of even our most thoroughly mapped and measured world. We tell ghost stories and dress in costumes, we light candles and leave offerings, we gather together and venture out into darkness, performing rituals that connect us back through generations to ancestors who knew that certain nights demanded recognition, that some boundaries deserved to be acknowledged, even if they could not be crossed. The stories we've explored tonight exist in a curious space between folklore and fact, between documented observation and enduring mystery. They are not ghost stories in the traditional sense, not tales meant to frighten or entertain, but rather accounts of genuine strangeness reported by people who were there, who witnessed something their training and experience couldn't easily explain, who wrote reports or gave testimony or left behind evidence that resists simple dismissal. Whether these accounts represent genuine anomalies in the fabric of reality, or misinterpretations of natural phenomena filtered through human perception and the peculiar psychology of threshold moments, we may never know with absolute certainty. But perhaps certainty isn't the point. Perhaps what matters is the act of attention itself, the willingness to sit with mystery rather than rushing to resolve it, the capacity to hold space for wonder even in an age that offers explanations for almost everything. The McMurdo signal may have been equipment malfunction, or ice sheet acoustics, or something else entirely. But what resonates across the years is the image of researchers in the cold darkness hearing something that seemed to pulse with intention from beneath the frozen world. The Lake Baikal encounter may have been seals and low visibility and nitrogen narcosis, but what persists is the sense of divers glimpsing forms that move through ancient waters with purposes of their own. The Black Vault Halloween files, with their decades of radar anomalies and auroral phenomena, remind us that even our most sophisticated detection systems sometimes register things that don't match expected patterns, that the sky above us contains movements and signals we can track but not fully explain. The Taos hum speaks to the possibility that perception itself is more mysterious than we usually acknowledge, that some people hear frequencies others cannot, that the world makes sounds we're still learning to detect and interpret. The Blue Ridge disappearance leaves us with photographs of fog and light, visual evidence of something that compelled 3 experienced hikers to carefully document before vanishing into mountains that have kept their secret for nearly 50 years. And the Halloween transmission, that monotone voice reading coordinates into the darkness at 2:17 in the morning, pointing toward empty space with such precision and purpose, becomes a kind of metaphor for all these mysteries, messages we can receive but not fully decode, signals that arrive from sources we cannot identify, speaking in patterns that suggest meaning even when we lack the framework to understand what that meaning might be. What all these accounts share is a quality of reaching, of human attention extending toward phenomena that exist at the boundaries of current knowledge, of curiosity persisting even in the face of ambiguity and uncertainty. They remind us that the world remains larger and stranger than our daily experience usually reveals, that mystery is not something that existed only in the past, before science and technology illuminated the darkness, but rather something that persists and evolves, taking new forms as our capacity to observe and document expands. Halloween serves as a cultural permission slip for this kind of attention, a night when we collectively acknowledge that it's acceptable to wonder, to speculate, to lean toward the unknown with fascination rather than fear. We mark this boundary not because the veil actually thins on October 31st, but because choosing to believe it might give us license to pay attention differently, to notice the strangeness that's present always but which we usually edit out in favour of more pressing concerns and practical considerations. The allegedly true nature of these accounts matters less, perhaps, than what they represent, our ongoing dialogue with mystery, our persistent curiosity about what lies beyond the edge of certainty. Whether these stories describe genuine anomalies or misperceptions elevated to legend by time and retelling, they serve the same function they've always served. They remind us to stay curious, to remain open to the possibility that understanding is always incomplete, that the universe contains more than we currently have frameworks to explain. As you drift towards sleep tonight, carrying these mysteries with you into dreams, consider that this state of not quite knowing might be not a frustration, but a gift, an invitation to remain wonderstruck in a world that too often demands certainty. The researchers at McMurdo, the divers in Lake Baikal, the radar operators watching their screens, the residents of Taos living with their persistent hum, the families of those who disappeared in the Blue Ridge, the radio operators who heard coordinates pointing nowhere, all of them experienced something that refused to resolve into simple explanation, and in that refusal found something worth carrying forward, worth documenting and sharing and returning to each time Halloween arrives. The quiet between worlds is not silence, but a different kind of sound, a frequency we're still learning to perceive, a whisper that speaks not of fear, but of possibility, of connection to something vaster than our individual understanding. On this night, when boundaries blur and attention sharpens, when we gather these strange accounts and hold them up to the light of curiosity rather than skepticism, we participate in something ancient and ongoing, the human impulse to reach beyond the known and touch, however briefly, whatever might be reaching back. So rest now. Let these mysteries settle gently into your thoughts like snow falling on distant mountains, like signals travelling through space toward coordinates we cannot map, like fog forming in forests where cameras capture light that shouldn't be there. Let yourself drift in that comfortable uncertainty, that space where wonder lives and questions don't demand immediate answers, where the strange and allegedly true can coexist with the ordinary and undeniable, all part of the same vast and mysterious universe we're privileged to inhabit and explore. The veil is thin tonight, they say, and perhaps they're right. Perhaps on this Halloween, as on every Halloween, something in the darkness is paying attention, listening as we listen, curious as we're curious, reaching across whatever boundaries separate here from there, now from then, known from unknown. And in the morning, when November light arrives and the threshold night recedes into memory, we'll carry forward what all these stories ultimately offer, not answers but awareness, not certainty but the beautiful, endless gift of wonder. Sleep well, listeners. The mysteries will still be here when you wake, waiting patiently in their files and memories and unexplained accounts, ready to be visited again when the next October arrives and the veil grows thin once more. Thank you for joining us for this special Halloween episode of Sleepy Side Stories. Until we meet again in the gentle, strange darkness, rest well, dream deeply, and remember that the universe is far more mysterious and marvellous than any single night can contain. Retry.